Of course, the majority of the American people were very relieved to get out of Afghanistan. But remember that they didn't know much about it. They hadn't been told much about it. So that people believed they were living in a $1 trillion war, that there were 100,000 troops on the ground. The reality is that combat operations finished in 2014. There were only 2,500 American soldiers left. There had been no casualties in 18 months, no British casualties since 2014. It would have been actually surprisingly risk-free, cost-free to stay and prevent the Taliban from taking over. And that's the sad thing, that people have been sold this story by political leaders that they're ending this huge forever war, when the truth of the matter is that quite a small presence could have done a lot of good.
And do you think that this sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan has impacted President Biden's domestic policies? I get the impression that the Republicans were much more about seeing the job through.
Yeah, it's definitely provided a huge stick for Republicans to beat with, both the decision to withdraw and also the way the withdrawal was done, the terrible chaos at the airport, the real problems of doing the evacuation. I think America's now moving on. The big challenge is, are they going to provide any humanitarian or development support to the 40 million Afghans that are still trapped inside Afghanistan, where starvation is now on its way? There's no money going into charities or UN agencies. The schools are shutting, the clinics are shutting.
It was hardly honourable to abandon the loyal Afghans who helped us to help them.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a terrible, terrible betrayal. We created the United States, its allies, over 20 years, a country that was deeply dependent on the West. We encouraged the development of a democracy. We created a military that was dependent on American air power, and then we cut all that off, removed the money that kept the budget going, disabled the Afghan Air Force, and left. And it's heartbreaking, because yes, of course, there were Afghans who supported the Taliban, but there were millions of Afghans whose lives have been getting better over 20 years. Women going to school, young men starting businesses, and all of that has been destroyed overnight. It's on its way again to being one of the very poorest countries in the world.
So what do you think the future holds for Afghanistan?
Well, it partly depends what the internationals decide to do. I think if America and Britain and other international countries continue to provide some degree of support, Afghan lives will be able to, hopefully, not get too much worse too quickly. But the likelihood is that within a few years, we're going to be looking at an Afghanistan which is very fragile, on the verge of civil war. There are terrorist groups now acting freely. So just 36 hours ago, there was a huge bomb in a place called Kunduz, in a Shia mosque, done by the Islamic State, which is now operating freely in Afghanistan. So I'm very, very worried. I'm very worried about what that will mean for the region, instability of the region, for refugees, for terrorism, but above all for Afghan people themselves, who are going to be suffering terribly. When I first saw that country 20 years ago, 1 in 5 children were dying before the age of 5. And if we don't support the clinics and the health system, I'm afraid that's the direction we're going to go back pretty quickly.